Mr. Vaughn, you've been paying your own shareholder $10 a day. The words landed in the courtroom like a quiet explosion, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to bend the air, and for the first time in his life, Richard Vaughn didn't have a response. He just stared, jaw tight, fingers frozen against the polished oak table as if the truth itself had weight. $10. Every single day. The same $10 he had flicked toward her without looking, like spare change you toss to a stranger on the street. The same $10 he thought erased her, reduced her, measured her worth. And now, every eye in that room was on him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with something colder, realization. Across the room, Emily Carter stood perfectly still, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, one hand resting lightly against the folder in front of her, as if it contained nothing more than paper instead of the quiet collapse of a man's empire. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because this moment had been years in the making, built not with anger, not with noise, but with patience. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing down again as if confirming what he had just read, as if even he couldn't quite believe it. Daily transfers. Consistent. Documented. Each word pressed deeper, methodical, precise. Richard let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, but it came out wrong, uneven, like something inside him had shifted and refused to settle back. He turned, just slightly, his eyes searching for something familiar, something he could control, but the room no longer belonged to him. Not the judge, not the attorneys, not even the silence. Because for years, Richard Vaughn had believed in numbers, in contracts, in ownership. He believed everything and everyone had a price, and he had set hers at $10 a day. The memory hit him then, uninvited and sharp in its clarity. Rain against glass. The cold marble floor of the foyer. A suitcase by the door. Emily standing there, 7 months pregnant, one hand braced against the curve of her stomach, the other gripping the handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He hadn't looked at her for long. He didn't need to. Vanessa had been upstairs, laughing softly, the sound drifting down like it belonged there now, like Emily never had. "You'll get $10 a day," he had said, his voice calm, businesslike, as if discussing a minor expense. Considerate support. He remembered the way the bills had felt between his fingers. Crisp, clean, final. He had dropped them onto the console table near the door. Not handed. Dropped. The sound had been small, almost nothing. A soft tap against wood. But Emily had looked at that money like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't beg. That had irritated him more than anything. Just a slight nod, a quiet inhale, and then she picked up the money, folded it once, and slipped it into her coat pocket like it meant something. Like it mattered. Like she mattered. And then she walked out. No scene. No last words. Just the soft click of the door closing behind her. Back in the courtroom, Richard blinked, the present snapping back into place, harsher now, less forgiving. $10. Every day? He had thought it was control. He had thought it was mercy. He had thought it was the end of her story. But as the judge's voice continued, steady and unavoidable, one thing became painfully clear. It hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. The first time Emily Carter spent that $10, she stood in the checkout line of a small grocery store on the edge of town, her fingers curled tightly around the bill as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip, the fluorescent lights above her buzzing softly, while the cashier waited with practiced patience. And for a moment, she almost walked away, almost convinced herself she did not need it, almost let pride win over survival. But then the baby shifted inside her, a small, steady reminder that this was no longer about pride, and she placed the bill on the counter with quiet precision, buying a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. Nothing more, nothing extra, just enough to get through another day. She kept the receipt, not because she had to, but because something inside her told her this mattered. That every dollar, every transaction, every moment of this new life needed to be recorded, not for anyone else, but for herself. The apartment she moved into 2 days later was barely 600 square feet, tucked above a laundromat that never seemed to close, the hum of machines running through the walls at all hours like a constant reminder that the world kept moving whether she was ready or not. And at night, when the city quieted just enough for her thoughts to get louder, she would sit by the window with a notebook in her lap, writing down numbers, dates, Amounts: $10 received, $10 spent, $10 saved. Over and over again, line after line, until the pattern became something more than survival, until it became structure. Richard Vaughn believed in numbers. She had learned that from him. He trusted them more than people, more than promises, more than anything that could not be measured or controlled, and so she began to think like he did. Not emotionally, not impulsively, precisely. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the transfer came through. $10. No message, no note, just a number appearing on a screen, cold and consistent, like it had nothing to do with her at all. At first, it felt like humiliation. Then it felt like routine. And then, slowly, it started to feel like something else. Something she could use. Weeks turned into months, and Emily did not miss a single entry. Not one. Even on the days when standing took more effort than she wanted to admit. Even when the summer heat pressed against the windows and made the air feel heavy and still. Even when the baby kicked hard enough to steal her breath for a second, she wrote it down. $10. Always 10. Always on time. Until one morning, it was not. The notification came at 8 o'clock like always, but the number was different. $10.42. She stared at the screen, her eyes narrowing slightly, her mind already moving ahead of her emotions, because this was not a mistake. Richard Vaughn did not make mistakes with money. Not small ones. Not ones that repeated. The next day, it happened again. $10.42. Then again, and again, the same extra 42 cents, consistent, precise, deliberate. Emily leaned back slowly in her chair, her hand resting against her stomach as she exhaled, not in confusion, but in recognition. Because numbers, when they changed, always told a story. And this one was just beginning to speak. Emily did not touch the extra 42 cents that day, or the next, or the day after that. Instead, she circled the number in her notebook, darker each time, pressing the pen harder against the paper as if force alone could reveal the pattern faster, because this was no longer about survival. This was about understanding, and understanding was the first step to control, something Richard Vaughn had always believed belonged only to him. She opened her laptop that evening, the old one with the slightly cracked hinge and the slow startup, and began searching through old files she had not looked at in months, documents from a life that felt distant but not erased, contracts she once reviewed without question, emails she once read without suspicion, spreadsheets that had once meant nothing more than background noise to a marriage built on trust she had given too freely. Now she read everything differently, carefully, line by line. The company name appeared again and again. Vaughn Holdings, structured, layered, complex in a way that suggested not just success but protection, and she remembered how proud he had been of that. How he used to say no one could ever touch what he built, no one could ever take it from him. And at the time she believed him, because she had never imagined she would need to. Her eyes paused on a document dated 3 years earlier, something small, something she almost skipped, a signature page attached to a stack of legal language she had signed during what Richard had called a routine restructuring. Nothing important, just paperwork, he had said, just making things more efficient, and she had signed it at the kitchen counter while dinner was still on the stove, barely reading past the first paragraph. She leaned closer now, her breath steady, her focus sharp, tracing her own name on the page as if seeing it for the first time. Emily Carter, listed not as a witness, not as a spouse, but as a minority stakeholder. The words sat there, simple, undeniable, and for a moment she did not move, did not react, because this was not confusion, this was recognition arriving late. Slowly, she turned to the next page, and the next, following the structure, the percentages, the distribution clauses, the language that once felt distant now unfolding with clarity. And then she saw it. The clause that made her sit back in her chair, one hand instinctively resting against her stomach as if grounding herself in something real. Dividend distribution. Proportional. Automated. Daily micro disbursements from minor accounts. Her eyes moved back to the numbers in her notebook, the steady pattern, the sudden change, the extra 42 cents, consistent, repeated, precise, and the connection formed not as a guess, but as a fact. Richard had not been giving her $10 out of pity. He had been transferring money from an account tied to ownership, tied to equity, tied to something he either forgot or never believed mattered. And the extra 42 cents was not random. It was growth. Small, almost invisible, but real. Emily closed the laptop slowly, her fingers resting on the edge for a second longer than necessary. And for the first time since she walked out of that house, she allowed herself a different kind of thought, not about what she had lost, but about what had never been taken from her at all. Because if the money was not a gift, then it was proof. And if it was proof, then it was power. And power, once understood, did not need to be loud to be undeniable. Emily did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to slow down, every piece of information rearranging itself into something sharper, something clearer, and by morning, the notebook in her lap was no longer just a record of survival. It had become a map. She flipped through the pages slowly, each line of $10, each entry precise, each date aligned. And now the numbers were no longer small, no longer insignificant. They were evidence of a system that had been working quietly in the background long before she ever realized it mattered. She stood by the window, the early light stretching across the worn wooden floor, one hand resting against her stomach as she counted again, not out of doubt, but out of habit, because numbers only meant something when they were verified. The total was still modest, nothing that would impress anyone, nothing that would make headlines. But that was not the point. The point was consistency, ownership, structure, the kind of things Richard valued more than anything else in the world. And now, for the first time, she saw how that same system could turn against him. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the notification appeared again. $10.42. Emily did not smile, did not react outwardly, but she wrote it down with a steadier hand than before, because this was no longer a question. It was confirmation. Later that afternoon, she made a call. The number had been sitting in her contacts for years, untouched, almost forgotten, but she remembered the name clearly. Daniel Hayes. He had been in one of those meetings long ago, quiet, observant, the kind of man who did not speak unless he had something worth saying. And at the time she had barely noticed him, just another face in a room full of professionals. Now he was exactly the kind of person she needed. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice calm, measured, as if interruptions did not surprise him. She did not introduce herself right away. Instead, she asked a question. Not emotional, not dramatic, precise. What happens when a minority stakeholder is paid daily dividends without acknowledgement from the majority owner? There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, but interest. The kind of silence that meant he was already thinking ahead. That depends, he said finally, his tone unchanged, on whether the stakeholder understands what they are receiving. Emily looked down at the notebook in her hand, the pages filled with proof, the numbers that had once felt like humiliation now aligning into something far more powerful. She does now, she replied. Another pause, slightly longer this time, and when Daniel spoke again, there was something different beneath the calm, something sharper, more focused. Then the majority owner has a problem he does not know exists. Emily ended the call without another word, her hand steady as she set the phone down, because that was all she needed to hear. Not reassurance, not sympathy, just confirmation that she was not imagining it, that this was real, that this mattered. She walked back to the table and opened her notebook again, flipping to the first page, the first $10, the first moment she thought her life had been reduced to something small and controlled, and she traced the number lightly with her finger, not with regret, but with understanding. Because what Richard Vaughn had built was designed to protect him from everyone else. He had never considered the possibility that the system itself would remember her, even after he tried to forget. And now, that system was still running, still counting, still paying, not out of kindness, not out of obligation, but out of structure. And structure, once set in motion, did not care who believed in it. It only cared about what was written down. And Emily had everything written down. Daniel Hayes did not call her back that day, and Emily did not expect him to, because men like him did not react. They calculated, and by the next morning, when the $10.42 appeared again, she already knew the silence meant movement, not hesitation. She continued her routine without interruption, writing the number down, aligning it with the previous entries, her handwriting now sharper, more deliberate, as if each stroke of ink carried weight beyond the page. The apartment still hummed with the same mechanical rhythm from the laundromat below, but it no longer felt temporary, no longer felt like a place she had been pushed into. It felt like a position she had chosen to hold, quietly, until the right moment arrived. That afternoon, her phone rang, the same number she had called the day before, and this time she answered on the first ring, her voice calm, controlled, unchanged. Daniel did not waste time with introductions. "I reviewed what you asked," he said, his tone even, but there was a precision in it now, something sharper beneath the surface, and "I pulled some public filings connected to Vaughn Holdings." Emily did not interrupt. She simply listened, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her notebook. "The structure is exactly what you suspected," he continued. "Minority shares were distributed during a restructuring 3 years ago. Small percentages, easily overlooked, especially if the primary owner believed they were insignificant." Emily glanced at the signature page still open on her laptop, her name sitting there in quiet defiance of everything that had followed. "And the daily transfers?" she asked. There was a brief pause, the kind that suggested confirmation rather than uncertainty. "Automated dividend allocation," Daniel replied, "scaled down to micro disbursements to avoid attention, but still legally binding. If those payments have been consistent, then the ownership has never been revoked." Emily closed her eyes for a second, not out of doubt, but to steady the realization as it settled fully into place, because this was no longer theory, no longer possibility, it was fact. "He thinks it is an allowance," she said quietly. Daniel let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Then he does not understand his own system," he answered. Emily looked down at the notebook again, at the pages filled with numbers that had once felt small, insignificant, almost insulting, and now read like a ledger of something much larger, something far more dangerous to the man who created it. "What happens if he finds out?" she asked, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to measure the reaction before it happened. Daniel did not hesitate this time. "If he finds out before you act, he will try to close the structure, reassign the shares, or bury the records," he said, his tone steady. "But if you move first, if you establish claim with documentation and legal backing, then he cannot erase what has already been distributed." Emily nodded slowly, even though he could not see it, her mind already stepping ahead, already aligning actions with outcomes. "Then I move first," she said. There was no emotion in her voice, no anger, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. Daniel did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice carried something new, something close to respect. "I will connect you with someone," he said. "A lawyer who understands structures like this, someone who knows how to make small numbers very loud in the right room." Emily closed her notebook gently, her hand resting on the cover for a moment longer than necessary, as if sealing everything inside it, every entry, every dollar, every piece of proof that had been building without anyone noticing. "Thank you," she said simply. The call ended, and for a moment, the room was quiet except for the distant hum below, steady, constant, unchanged. But Emily was not the same person who had first walked into this space, not the woman who had picked up $10 from a table and thought it was the end of her story. Because now she understood something Richard Vaughn never considered. Systems do not forget. Numbers do not lie. And the smallest amount, repeated long enough, becomes something impossible to ignore. The lawyer's office did not look like the kind of place that handled million-dollar structures or corporate disputes, and that was exactly why Emily knew Daniel had chosen it carefully, because nothing about her situation needed attention yet, it needed precision. The building was 3 stories tall, tucked between a pharmacy and a small insurance agency, the kind of place people passed every day without noticing, and inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, quiet, controlled, predictable. Emily sat across from Laura Mitchell, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a calm presence that did not rely on appearance to command authority. And for the first few minutes, neither of them spoke much, because everything Emily needed to say was already written down. She slid the notebook across the desk first, not the legal documents, not the printed files, but the pages filled with numbers, dates, entries that had been recorded with discipline no one had asked for, but would soon matter more than anything else. Laura opened it slowly, flipping through the pages without rushing, her expression unchanged, but her focus unmistakable, because she understood immediately what she was looking at. Consistency, pattern, evidence. How long? Laura asked finally, her voice even, not surprised, not impressed, just measuring. "Every day," Emily replied. "Since the day I left." Laura nodded once, then reached for the printed documents Emily had placed beside the notebook, the restructuring agreement, the signature pages, the clauses that had once meant nothing and now meant everything. And as she read, the silence in the room shifted, not heavier, but sharper, like something invisible had just taken shape. "He built this to protect himself," Laura said after a moment, more as a statement than a question. Emily did not respond. She already knew that. "But he assumed the smallest piece would never matter," Laura continued, her finger tracing a line in the document. "The clause that tied ownership to automated distribution, the exact mechanism Richard Vaughn had trusted without question." She closed the file gently and looked up, her gaze steady, direct. "He did not remove you," she said. "He buried you." Emily felt the words settle, not as an insult, not as something emotional, but as a fact that aligned perfectly with everything she had uncovered. Buried meant still there, still active, still connected. "And now?" Emily asked. Laura leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the desk, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested control, not comfort. "Now you decide when this becomes visible," she replied. "Because once we file, once we establish your position formally, there is no quiet way for him to fix this." Emily glanced down at the notebook again, at the first page, the first $10, the moment she thought she had been reduced to something small, something controlled, and for the first time, she allowed herself to see it differently. Not as humiliation, as a transaction, a recorded, repeated, undeniable transaction. "What do we need?" she asked. Laura did not hesitate. "Everything you already have," she said, tapping the notebook lightly. "And timing." Emily looked back up, her expression unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted, something steadier, more defined. "Then we do it right," she said. Laura gave a small nod, not approving, not encouraging, just acknowledging the decision. "We do it when it cannot be undone," she replied. Emily stood slowly, her hand resting briefly against the curve of her stomach, grounding herself not in fear, but in clarity, because every step now was deliberate, every action aligned with something larger than reaction. As she walked out of the office and into the quiet street, the world looked exactly the same as it had the day before, the same buildings, the same passing cars, the same unnoticed corners. But for Emily, nothing about it was unchanged. Because she was no longer waiting. She was preparing. And preparation, when done correctly, did not need to be loud to be irreversible. The first notice was sent on a Tuesday morning, precisely at 9:15, not rushed, not delayed, but timed with the kind of intention that turned paperwork into something far more consequential than ink on a page. And when Richard Vaughn's assistant placed the envelope on his desk, it looked no different from the dozens of documents he received every day: contracts, approvals, reports, all part of a system he believed he understood completely. He did not open it immediately. He finished his call first, his voice steady, confident, discussing numbers that sounded larger, more important, more worthy of his attention, and only when the room was quiet again did he reach for the envelope, sliding a finger under the seal with the same casual precision he applied to everything else. At first, nothing about the document stood out. Legal language, structured paragraphs, familiar formatting. But then his eyes paused, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for the rhythm of his reading to break, and he went back to the line again, slower this time. Emily Carter. The name sat there without explanation, without introduction, as if it had never left, as if it had always belonged in that space. His expression did not change immediately. Years of control had trained him well. But something behind his eyes shifted, something small but undeniable, like a calculation that no longer balanced. He turned the page. Then the next. Each line connecting to the last. Each clause reinforcing something he had never considered necessary to revisit. And by the time he reached the section outlining distribution records, the air in the room felt different, not heavier, but sharper, like every detail suddenly mattered more than it had seconds before. Across the city, Emily sat at the same small table by her window, the notebook open in front of her, the pen resting between her fingers, but she was not writing this time. She was waiting, not passively, not nervously, but with the kind of stillness that came from knowing the first move had already been made. Her phone remained silent, and she did not check it, did not reach for it, because this part did not require reaction. It required patience. Richard leaned back in his chair slowly, the document still in his hand, his mind moving faster now, not through emotion, but through structure, tracing the system he had built, the layers he had trusted, the mechanisms he believed were flawless, and for the first time, he saw something he had overlooked. Not a flaw. Not exactly. Something smaller. Something he had dismissed as insignificant. A percentage. A name. A signature. Emily Carter. He stood abruptly, not out of panic, but out of urgency, the kind that came when control shifted without permission, and crossed the room to the glass wall overlooking the city, his reflection staring back at him, composed, unchanged, except for the slight tension in his jaw. He had not thought about her in months. Not really. She had been removed from his life with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. Clean. Final. Controlled. And yet, here she was, not in person, not in memory, but in structure, in documentation, in something far more difficult to erase. Back in the apartment, Emily finally reached for her phone, not to check messages, but to note the time. 9:27. She wrote it down. Not because she needed to remember, but because every step mattered now, every second part of a sequence that had been set in motion the moment she chose to act. The room remained quiet, the city outside moving as it always did, unaware of the shift taking place within it, and Emily closed the notebook gently, her hand resting on the cover for just a moment, because she understood something Richard was only beginning to realize. This was no longer about money. It was about recognition. And once something is recognized within a system built on precision, it cannot simply be ignored. It has to be addressed. And she had just made herself impossible to overlook. Richard did not call his legal team right away, and that was his first mistake, because men like him believed control could be restored by thinking faster, by moving ahead of the problem before anyone else realized it existed. And so he stayed where he was, the document still open in his hand, his mind already running through scenarios, adjustments, quiet corrections that could erase what should never have surfaced. He walked back to his desk slowly, placing the papers down with deliberate care, as if handling them too quickly might confirm something he was not ready to accept. And then he opened his laptop, pulling up internal records, account structures, distribution logs, the system he trusted more than memory, more than people, more than anything that could not be quantified. At first, everything looked the same. Clean. Ordered. Controlled. But then he narrowed the search, filtering by minor accounts, by inactive stakeholders, by names that should have disappeared long ago, and there it was again. Emily Carter. Not removed. Not reassigned. Still present. Still connected. Still receiving. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, not frozen, but recalibrating, because this was not supposed to happen. Not in his system. Not under his control. He clicked into the distribution records, scrolling through the entries with increasing precision, each line confirming what the document had already suggested: daily transfers, consistent, automated, untouched, and then he saw the adjustment. 42 cents. Repeated. Structured. Not an error. Growth. Small, controlled, but real. Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his expression tightening just enough to reveal what he rarely allowed anyone to see. Disruption. Not emotional. Structural. Because if the system was still recognizing her, then the system was still bound to her, and that meant something far more significant than the amount itself. It meant acknowledgement. Across the city, Emily sat in the same place, but she was no longer waiting in silence. She was organizing, her notebook now accompanied by printed copies, highlighted clauses, timelines drawn with careful lines that connected actions to outcomes, every step mapped with the same precision Richard had once admired in his own work. Her phone buzzed once, and she glanced at it without urgency. A message from Laura. Filed. That was all it said. One word. No explanation. No need. Emily set the phone down and closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in alignment, because this was the moment everything shifted from preparation to exposure. Richard picked up his phone then, finally, dialing his attorney with the same steady hand he used in every negotiation, every acquisition, every decision that required control, But this time, when the call connected, his first words were not instructions. They were a question. Why is she still in the structure? The silence on the other end was not reassuring. It was calculating. And that was when he understood something he had not considered before. This was not a mistake he could correct quietly. Because the moment it was filed, it stopped being internal. It became visible, trackable, verifiable. He stood again, moving faster now, crossing the room as if distance itself needed to be closed, his reflection catching in the glass once more, but this time he did not look at it, because control was no longer something he could assume. It was something he had to recover. Emily, meanwhile, opened her notebook to the final page she had prepared, a clean sheet, untouched, waiting, and she wrote one line across the top in steady, deliberate letters. Recognition established. Then she closed it, her hand resting on the cover as the quiet of the room settled around her. Unchanged, calm, almost indifferent to what had just begun, because the system Richard Vaughn built was still running, still counting, still following its own rules, and now those rules were no longer working for him alone. They were working for her, and there was nothing he could do to stop what had already been recorded. The courtroom was quieter than anyone expected, not tense, not chaotic, but controlled, the kind of silence that settles when every person in the room senses that something irreversible is about to be confirmed rather than argued. And Richard Vaughn sat at the front, his posture straight, his expression composed, but the stillness around him was no longer the kind he commanded, it was the kind he endured. The judge adjusted a stack of documents, flipping to a marked section with deliberate care, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, carrying across the room without effort, each word landing with precision rather than force. The court recognizes the claimant as a valid minority stakeholder under the existing corporate structure, he said, pausing just long enough for the meaning to settle, not for effect, but because the language itself required acknowledgement. Richard did not react outwardly, but his hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table, the smallest movement, almost invisible, but enough to reveal the shift beneath the surface. Across the room, Emily Carter stood quietly, her presence unchanged from the moment she walked in. No display, no tension, just a calm that did not need to prove itself. She had chosen a simple dress, nothing designed to draw attention, nothing that suggested transformation, because this moment was not about appearance. It was about recognition. The judge continued, referencing distribution records, documented transfers, consistent entries that aligned perfectly with the structure Richard had built himself, and as each point was confirmed, it became clearer that this was not a dispute over interpretation. It was a confirmation of fact. The daily transfers, the exact amounts, the additional 42 cents that marked growth rather than error, all of it recorded, all of it traceable, all of it binding. Richard's attorney spoke briefly, carefully, attempting to frame the payments as informal, discretionary, something outside the structure, but the argument did not hold, not against documentation that had been maintained with precision over time. Emily did not speak. She did not need to. Her notebook sat on the table in front of her, closed now. Its purpose already fulfilled, every entry inside it mirrored by records that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. The judge placed the final document down, his gaze moving between both parties, not with judgment, but with clarity. Ownership, once established and continuously recognized through structured distribution, cannot be retroactively dismissed, he said, his tone unchanged, but final. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, but no longer confident, because for the first time, the system he trusted completely had aligned against him, not out of intention, not out of emotion, but out of design. Emily reached for her notebook then, her fingers resting on it for a brief moment before she picked it up, not hurried, not delayed, just deliberate, the same way she had written every entry inside it, the same way she had moved through every step that led to this room. She did not look at Richard as she turned to leave. She did not need to see his reaction, did not need confirmation of what he had lost or realized, because this was never about him understanding. It was about the system acknowledging what had always been true. As the doors behind her closed with a soft, final sound, the courtroom remained quiet for a moment longer, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been recorded. and somewhere between $10 and 42 cents, repeated every single day. A woman who was once dismissed had become impossible to deny.